Each year on Remembrance Day, we take time to honor the armistice that ended World War I and to tell stories of the service and sacrifice of people in the Canadian Armed Forces. Today, as we pause to remember, it is important to lift up the stories of Indigenous people and Canadian people of color whose sacrifices for Canada are often overlooked and underappreciated.
As settlers working towards reconciliation, we in Peel now begin our days with an acknowledgement that we are gathering on lands that have been home to Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations for thousands of years. We acknowledge their stewardship and care over these lands, in the past and today, a care that means we are able to gather here today to share stories and to remember. To make our commitment to reconciliation real, we must also take time to share the stories of the Indigenous people who served and sacrificed in wars, often in the name of a country and an empire that did not recognize their humanity and bravery.
More than 12,000 Indigenous people fought for Canada in the First and Second World Wars and the Korean War. These determined volunteers were often forced to overcome many challenges to serve in uniform. Before 1960, a white government employee called an Indian agent still had authority over who could leave the reserve. Instead of being free to move about on their own land, Indigenous people were forced to ask permission to journey anywhere, including to travel to Europe to fight in the war.
One renowned Indigenous soldier in the First World War was Colonel Francis Pegamagabo, an Ojibwe man from the Wasauksing First Nations near Parry Sound, Ontario. He signed up to serve 9 days after the war was declared, fought all 4 years as an expert marksman and scout, and by the end of the war he was both the most decorated Indigenous soldier and the most effective sniper of the entire war.
At the end of the war, many Indigenous people expected their wartime contributions to result in a new atmosphere when they returned home. But this hope for change did not materialize. While the white soldiers received money from the Veterans Benefits and land under the Veterans Land Act, Indigenous soldiers did not get any money or land. In addition, systemic racism and the continuing power of the Indian agents in Canada controlled their lives and limited their freedom.
Black Canadian soldiers have also played a role in Canada's military for over 200 years. Many Black Canadians trace their family roots to Loyalists who moved north in the 1780s after the American Revolutionary War. At that time, Black people who have been enslaved in America were offered freedom and land if they agreed to fight on the British side, and thousands seized this opportunity, hoping for a new life in what we now call Canada. Black soldiers fought on the British side in the War of 1812. They helped stop the rebellion in Upper Canada in 1837, and they fought in the Boer War.
By 1914, World War I drew millions into combat, and though Canada needed as many soldiers as possible, they did not accept Black people who wanted to be soldiers. Young Black men had to fight the government to allow them to serve their country. As a result, the No. 2 Construction Battalion was created and 605 men volunteered. The battalion built and repaired trenches, roads, railways, and barbed wire barriers, always working in very dangerous conditions. As the war continued, members of the battalion and other Black Canadians were so determined to contribute that more than 2,000 of them managed to join regular units and serve as combat soldiers, giving distinguished service and earning medals for bravery. Ethelbert Curley Christian and Seymour Tyler fought bravely in the battle for Vimy Ridge, one of Canada's most famous military efforts.
30 years later, thousands of Black men and women served during the Second World War. While some Black recruits would encounter resistance when trying to enlist in the Army, no segregated battalions were created. Black Canadians joined regular units and served alongside their fellow white soldiers. Despite the particularly racist policies of the Royal Canadian Navy and Royal Canadian Air Force, trailblazing Black Canadians like Leonard Braithwaite served as pilots.
Many Black veterans returned home after the Second World War with heightened awareness of the value of freedom and their right to be treated as equals, after all they did to serve in their country's time of need.
The Toronto Negro Veterans Association put pressure on the Ministry of Health and nursing schools, and, as a result, Black women were finally admitted for training and gradually employed in hospitals across Ontario by the late 1940s and early 1950s.
So on this day, as we remember and honor the sacrifices of our ancestors, we must work to tell the whole truth of what they went through in order to serve. It is time for all Canadians to acknowledge that systemic racism exists, both in our past and in our present, and it needs to end. It is time to make meaningful changes that will end systemic racism in Canadian institutions. It is time to remember the real history.